Hello, this is your Right Geek, picking up where I got cut off in the last video. So I was in the middle of talking about how 616 Tony and MCU Tony both share the occasional fits of anger, and I was in the middle of talking about Tony in the MCU. In Iron Man 3, he was visiting Happy in the hospital, and when he gets outside, he gets swarmed by press, and he ends up challenging a terrorist to a cage fight and then throwing somebody's phone against the wall. Well, what I was going to add to that before my storage ran out is that 616 Tony has his moments of anger too. In Tales of Suspense and in Volume 1, I can think of two instances off the top of my head in which 616 Tony is in his office and he's upset about something, and he starts banging against the wall and breaking stuff. And then you get this cut to another panel where the people outside the door are like, "What the devil is going on in there?" And then somebody usually, and I think in both cases it was either Pepper or Happy, were like, "You know what? I'm not sure, but I've learned never to walk into the boss's office when he's in there." So we also have that moment when late in Volume 1, Tony tries to build a space station and then unfortunately gets infected by a contagion and becomes unusable. And when that happens, he very nearly breaks his model of his dream space station, but then he's like, "You know what? I'm too tired. Maybe I'll break it tomorrow," which is kind of funny. So they have both versions of the character do have those moments where they break stuff because they're upset. I also wrote down futurism, which is kind of obvious. Both characters are invested in technological progress. That is basically one of the central aspects of their character. It's reflected in the way that the armor evolves in both canons. It's also reflected in the things that both Tony Starks do with their time when they're not running around with the Super Friends. We have, Tony Stark in the MCU, obviously, using his considerable resources to fund futuristic research, as well as philanthropic endeavors. We have Tony in the 616 building space stations, and I seem to recall at one point that the SI campus had a monorail and an arch and other kinds of sort of World's Fair-y kind of things that were indicators that this is a company about the future and about improving the future and making it better. So they both have that aspect in common. And then I wrote down wealth and celebrity. That's pretty obvious too. They are both written as characters who are extraordinarily wealthy and also extraordinarily famous with the media. And then I drew a little brain doodle, and I said that brain doodle equals superpower, parentheses cactus plane. And basically what I mean by that is basically the answer to the question, take that armor off and what are you, which is asked in the MCU. In both the MCU and the 616, the answer is very simple. He's the guy who made the armor. And there's somebody on the internet who wrote up a meme where they basically said, and he was referring to MCU Tony, but this applies to 616 Tony too. If you take either Tony and you strand him in a featureless desert, he will manage to fly out of there on a plane made out of cactus and sand because he is Tony effing Stark. And when I read that meme, I said, that is 100% accurate. Iron Man's actual superpower is not the armor. The armor is just the manifestation of the superpower. The actual superpower is his intelligence. And we see that both in the MCU and in the 616 in the situations in which Tony is deprived of his armor and has to survive without it. And he manages every time because it isn't about the armor. It's really about the man and his ingenuity and his ability to survive based just on his brain power. And then finally, the really big one, self-sacrifice. In the video I did on Wednesday, I pointed out one little moment early in Tales of Suspense in which, in order to defeat a villain, Tony puts himself in harm's way. And that's something that Tony in the 616 does repeatedly. He has kind of a self-sacrificial and sometimes it borders on a self-destructive tendency. And that is an essential aspect of his heroism. And I think the self-sacrifice being a theme with MCU Tony at this point is blindingly obvious. So that finishes up my sort of roundup of what's the same and what's different between stable era 616 Tony and MCU. Hopefully, if there are any normies watching this, I have generated some interest in the comics because I do really love the comics too, even though in many ways they are extraordinarily different. And I hope those who read the comics too also appreciate this analysis. And if you have anything to add, please comment below. Thank you for listening.